In the summer of 1960, while I was an anthropology student at the University of California, Los Angeles, I made several trips to the Southwest to collect information on the medicinal plants used by the Indians of the area. The events I describe here began during one of my trips. I was waiting in a border town for a Greyhound bus, talking with a friend who had been my guide and helper in the survey. Suddenly, he leaned toward me and whispered that the man, a white-haired old Indian who was sitting in front of the window, was very learned about plants, especially peyote. I asked my friend to introduce me to this man. My friend greeted him, then went over and shook his hand. After they had talked for a while, my friend signaled me to join them, but immediately left me alone with the old man, not even bothering to introduce us. He was not in the least embarrassed. I told him my name, and he said that he was called Juan, and that he was at my service. He used the Spanish polite form of address. We shook hands at my initiative, and then remained silent for some time. It was not a strained silence, but a quietness, natural and relaxed on both sides. Though his dark face and neck were wrinkled, showing his age, it struck me that his body was agile and muscular. I then told him that I was interested in obtaining information about medicinal plants. Although in truth I was almost totally ignorant about peyote, I found myself pretending that I knew a great deal, and even suggesting that it might be to his advantage to talk with me. As I rattled on, he nodded slowly and looked at me, but said nothing. I avoided his eyes, and we finished by standing, the two of us, in dead silence. Finally, after what seemed a very long time, Don Juan got up and looked out of the window. His bus had come. He said goodbye and left the station. I was annoyed at having talked nonsense to him, and it being seen through by those remarkable eyes. When my friend returned, he tried to console me for my failure to learn anything from Don Juan. He explained that the old man was often silent or noncommittal, but the disturbing effect of this first encounter was not so easily dispelled. I made Don Juan's acquaintance under the most fortuitous circumstances. I was sitting with Bill, a friend of mine, in a bus depot in a border town in Arizona. We were very quiet. In the late afternoon, the summer heat seemed unbearable. Suddenly, he leaned over and tapped me on the shoulder. "There's the man I told you about," he said in a low voice. He nodded casually toward the entrance. An old man had just walked in. "What did you tell me about him?" I asked. "He's the Indian that knows about peyote, remember?" I remembered that Bill and I had once driven all day looking for the house of an eccentric Mexican Indian who lived in the area. We didn't find the man's house, and I had the feeling that the Indians whom we'd asked for directions had deliberately misled us. Bill had told me that the man was a yerbero, a person who gathers and sells medicinal herbs, and that he knew a great deal about the hallucinogenic cactus, peyote. He had also said that it would be worth my while to meet him. Bill was my guide in the Southwest while I was collecting information and specimens of medicinal plants used by the Indians of the area. Bill got up and went to greet the man. The Indian was of medium height. His hair was white and short, and grew a bit over his ears, accentuating the roundness of his head. He was very dark. The deep wrinkles on his face gave him the appearance of age, yet his body seemed to be strong and fit. I watched him for a moment. He moved around with a nimbleness that I would have thought impossible for an old man. Bill signaled me to join them. "He's a nice guy," Bill said to me, "but I can't understand him. His Spanish is weird, full of rural colloquialisms, I suppose." The old man looked at Bill and smiled. And Bill, who speaks only a few words of Spanish, made up an absurd phrase in that language. He looked at me as if asking whether he was making sense, but I didn't know what he had in mind. He then smiled shyly and walked away. The old man looked at me and began laughing. I explained to him that my friend sometimes forgot that he didn't speak Spanish. "I think he also forgot to introduce us," I said, and I told him my name. "And I am Juan Matus, at your service," he said. We shook hands and remained quiet for some time. I broke the silence and told him about my enterprise. I told him that I was looking for any kind of information on plants, especially peyote. I talked compulsively for a long time, and although I was almost totally ignorant on the subject, I said I knew a great deal about peyote. I thought that if I boasted about my knowledge, he would become interested in talking to me. But he didn't say anything. He listened patiently. Then he nodded slowly and peered at me. His eyes seemed to shine with a light of their own. I avoided his gaze. I felt embarrassed. I had the certainty that at that moment he knew I was talking nonsense. "Come to my house sometime," he finally said, taking his eyes away from me. "Perhaps we could talk there with more ease." I didn't know what else to say. I felt uneasy. After a while, Bill came back into the room. He recognized my discomfort and didn't say a word. We sat in tight silence for some time. Then the old man got up. His bus had come. He said goodbye. "It didn't go too well, did it?" Bill asked. "No. Did you ask him about plants?" "I did, but I think I goofed. I told you, he's very eccentric. The Indians around here know him, yet they never mention him. And that's something. He said I could come to his house, though." "He was bullshitting you. Sure, you can go to his house, but what does it mean? He'll never tell you anything. If you ever ask him anything, he'll clam up as if you were an idiot talking nonsense." Bill said convincingly that he had encountered people like him before, people who gave the impression of knowing a great deal. In his judgment, he said, such people weren't worth the trouble, because sooner or later one could obtain the same information from someone else who didn't play hard to get. He said that he had neither patience nor time for old fogies, and that it was possible that the old man was only presenting himself as being knowledgeable about herbs, when in reality he knew as little as the next man. Bill went on talking, but I wasn't listening. My mind kept on wondering about the old Indian. He knew I'd been bluffing. I remembered his eyes. They had actually shone. I went back to see him a couple of months later, not so much as a student of anthropology interested in medicinal plants, but as a person with an inexplicable curiosity. The way he had looked at me was an unprecedented event in my life. I wanted to know what was involved in that look. It became almost an obsession with me. I pondered it, and the more I thought about it, the more unusual it seemed to be.
"I understand you know a great deal about plants, sir," I said to the old Indian in front of me. A friend of mine had just put us in contact, and left the room, and we had introduced ourselves to each other. The old man had told me that his name was Juan Matus. "Did your friend tell you that?" he asked casually. "Yes, he did." "I pick plants. Or rather, they let me pick them," he said softly. We were in the waiting room of a bus depot in Arizona. I asked him in very formal Spanish if he would allow me to question him. I said, "Would the gentleman, caballero, permit me to ask some questions?" Caballero, which is derived from the word caballo, or horse, originally meant horseman or a nobleman on horseback. He looked at me inquisitively. "I'm a horseman without a horse," he said with a big smile. And then he added, "I've told you that my name is Juan Matus." I liked his smile. I thought that, obviously, he was a man that could appreciate directness, and I decided to boldly tackle him with a request. I told him I was interested in collecting and studying medicinal plants. I said that my special interest was the uses of the hallucinogenic cactus, peyote, which I had studied at length at the university in Los Angeles. I thought that my presentation was very serious. I was very contained, and sounded perfectly credible to myself. The old man shook his head slowly, and I, encouraged by his silence, added that it would no doubt be profitable for us to get together and talk about peyote. It was at that moment that he lifted his head and looked me squarely in the eyes. It was a formidable look. Yet it wasn't menacing or awesome in any way. It was a look that went through me. I became tongue-tied at once and couldn't continue with the harangues about myself. That was the end of our meeting. Yet he left on a note of hope. He said that perhaps I could visit him at his house someday. It would be difficult to assess the impact of Don Juan's look if my inventory of experience is not somehow brought to bear on the uniqueness of that event. When I began to study anthropology and thus met Don Juan, I was already an expert in getting around. I had left my home years before, and that meant in my evaluation that I was capable of taking care of myself. Whenever I was rebuffed, I could usually cajole my way in or make concessions, argue, get angry, or, if nothing succeeded, I would whine or complain. In other words, there was always something I knew I could do under the circumstances, and never in my life had any human being stopped my momentum so swiftly and so definitely as Don Juan did that afternoon. But it wasn't only a matter of being silenced. There had been times when I'd been unable to say a word to my opponent because of some inherent respect I felt for him. Still, my anger or frustration was manifested in my thoughts. Don Juan's look, however, numbed me to the point that I couldn't think coherently. I became thoroughly intrigued with that stupendous look and decided to search for him. I prepared myself for 6 months after that first meeting, reading up on the uses of peyote among the American Indians, especially about the peyote cult of the Indians of the Plains. I became acquainted with every work available, and when I felt I was ready, I went back to Arizona. I made a point of finding out where Don Juan lived, and later visited him several times. On each visit, I tried to lead him to discuss peyote, but without success. We became, nonetheless, very good friends, and my scientific investigation was forgotten, or was at least redirected into channels that were worlds apart from my original intention. The friend who had introduced me to Don Juan explained later that the old man was not a native of Arizona, where we met, but was a Yaqui Indian from Sonora, Mexico. At first, I saw Don Juan simply as a rather peculiar man who knew a great deal about peyote and who spoke Spanish remarkably well. But the people with whom he lived believed that he had some sort of secret knowledge, that he was a brujo. The Spanish word brujo means, in English, medicine man, curer, witch, or sorcerer. It connotes essentially a person who has extraordinary and usually evil powers. I had known Don Juan for a whole year before he took me into his confidence. One day, he explained that he possessed a certain knowledge that he had learned from a teacher, a benefactor, as he called him, who had directed him in a kind of apprenticeship. Don Juan had, in turn, chosen me to serve as his apprentice, but he warned me that I would have to make a very deep commitment, and that the training was long and arduous. In describing his teacher, Don Juan used the word diablero. Later, I learned that diablero is a term used only by the Sonoran Indians. It refers to an evil person who practices black sorcery and is capable of transforming himself into an animal, a bird, a dog, a coyote, or any other creature. On one of my visits to Sonora, I had a peculiar experience that illustrated the Indians' feelings about diableros. I was driving at night in the company of 2 Indian friends when I saw an animal that seemed to be a dog crossing the highway. One of my companions said it was not a dog, but a huge coyote. I slowed down and pulled to the side of the road to get a good look at the animal. It stayed within range of the headlights a few seconds longer and then ran into the chaparral. It was unmistakably a coyote, but it was twice the ordinary size. Talking excitedly, my friends agreed that it was a very unusual animal, and one of them suggested that it might be a diablero. I decided to use an account of the experience to question the Indians of that area about their beliefs in the existence of diableros. I talked with many people, telling them the story and asking them questions. The 3 conversations that follow indicate what they felt. "Do you think it was a coyote, Choi?" I asked a young man after he had heard the story. "Who knows? A dog, no doubt. Too large for a coyote." "Do you think it may have been a diablero?" "That's a lot of bull. There are no such things." "Why do you say that, Choi?" "People imagine things. I bet if you had caught that animal, you would have seen that it was a dog. Once, I had some business in another town and got up before daybreak and saddled up a horse. As I was leaving, I came upon a dark shadow on the road, which looked like a huge animal. My horse reared, throwing me off the saddle. I was pretty scared, too, but it turned out that the shadow was a woman who was walking to town." "Do you mean, Choi, that you don't believe there are diableros?" "Diableros? What's a diablero? Tell me what a diablero is." "I don't know, Choi. Manuel, who was riding with me that night, said the coyote could have been a diablero. Maybe you could tell me what a diablero is." "A diablero, they say, is a brujo who changes into any form he wants to adopt. But everybody knows that's pure bull. The old people here are full of stories about diableros. You won't find that among us younger people." "What kind of animal do you think it was, Doña Luz?" I asked a middle-aged woman. "Only God knows that for sure. But I think it wasn't a coyote. There are things that appear to be coyotes, but are not. Was the coyote running, or was it eating?" "It was standing most of the time, but when I first saw it, I think it was eating something." "Are you sure it wasn't carrying something in its mouth?" "Perhaps it was, but tell me, would that make any difference?" "Yes, it would. If it was carrying something in its mouth, it wasn't a coyote." "What was it then?" "It was a man or a woman." "What do you call such people, Doña Luz?" She didn't answer. I questioned her for a while longer, but without success. Finally, she said she didn't know. I asked her if such people were called diableros, and she answered that diablero was one of the names given to them. "Do you know any diableros?" I asked. "I knew one woman," she replied. "She was killed. It happened when I was a little girl. The woman, they said, used to turn into a female dog, and one night a dog went into the house of a white man to steal cheese. The white man killed the dog with a shotgun, and at the very moment the dog died in the house of the white man, the woman died in her own hut. Her kin got together and went to the white man and demanded payment. The white man paid good money for having killed her." "How could they demand payment if it was only a dog he killed?" "They said that the white man knew it wasn't a dog because other people were with him and they all saw that the dog stood up on its legs like a man and reached for the cheese, which was on a tray hanging from the roof. The men were waiting for the thief because the white man's cheese was being stolen every night, so the man killed the thief, knowing it wasn't a dog." "Are there any diableros nowadays, Doña Luz?" "Such things are very secret. They say there are no more diableros, but I doubt it, because one member of a diablero's family has to learn what the diablero knows. Diableros have their own laws, and one of them is that a diablero has to teach his secrets to one of his kin." "What do you think the animal was, Genaro?" I asked a very old man. "A dog from one of the ranchos of that area. What else?" "It could have been a diablero." A diablero? You're crazy. There are no diableros. Do you mean that there are none today, or that there never were any? At one time there were, yes. It's common knowledge. Everybody knows that. But the people were very afraid of them and had them all killed. Who killed them, Genaro? All the people of the tribe. The last diablero I knew about was S. He killed dozens, maybe even hundreds of people with his sorcery. We couldn't put up with that, and the people got together and took him by surprise one night and burned him alive. How long ago was that, Genaro? In 1942. Did you see it yourself? No, but people still talk about it. They say that there were no ashes left, even though the stake was made of fresh wood. All that was left at the end was a huge pool of grease. Although Don Juan categorized his benefactor as a diablero, he never mentioned the place where he had acquired his knowledge, nor did he identify his teacher. In fact, Don Juan disclosed very little about his personal life. All he said was that he had been born in the Southwest in 1891, that he had spent nearly all his life in Mexico, that in 1900 his family was exiled by the Mexican government to central Mexico, along with thousands of other Sonoran Indians, and that he had lived in central and southern Mexico until 1940. Thus, as Don Juan had traveled a great deal, his knowledge may have been the product of many influences. And although he regarded himself as an Indian from Sonora, I wasn't sure the context of his knowledge totally in the culture of the Sonoran Indians. But it's not my intention here to determine his precise cultural milieu.
For the purpose of presenting my argument, I must first explain the basic premise of sorcery, as Don Juan presented it to me. He said that for a sorcerer, the world of everyday life is not real, or out there, as we believe it is. For a sorcerer, reality, or the world we all know, is only a description. For the sake of validating this premise, Don Juan concentrated the best of his efforts into leading me to a genuine conviction that what I held in mind as the world at hand was merely a description of the world, a description that had been pounded into me from the moment I was born. He pointed out that everyone who comes into contact with a child is a teacher who incessantly describes the world to him, until the moment when the child is capable of perceiving the world as it is described. According to Don Juan, we have no memory of that portentous moment, simply because none of us could possibly have had any point of reference to compare it to anything else. From that moment on, however, the child is a member. He knows the description of the world, and his membership becomes full-fledged, I suppose, when he is capable of making all the proper perceptual interpretations which, by conforming to that description, validate it. For Don Juan, then, the reality of our day-to-day life consists of an endless flow of perceptual interpretations which we, the individuals who share a specific membership, have learned to make in common. The idea that the perceptual interpretations that make up the world have a flow is congruous with the fact that they run uninterruptedly and are rarely, if ever, open to question. In fact, the reality of the world we know is so taken for granted that the basic premise of sorcery, that our reality is merely one of many descriptions, could hardly be taken as a serious proposition. Fortunately, in the case of my apprenticeship, Don Juan was not concerned at all with whether or not I could take his proposition seriously, and he proceeded to elucidate his points in spite of my opposition, my disbelief, and my inability to understand what he was saying. Thus, as a teacher of sorcery, Don Juan endeavored to describe the world to me from the very first time we talked. My difficulty in grasping his concepts and methods
stemmed from the fact that the units of his description were alien and incompatible with those of my own. Saturday, December 17th, 1960. I found his house after making long and taxing inquiries among the local Indians. It was early afternoon when I arrived and parked in front of it. I saw him sitting on a wooden milk crate. He seemed to recognize me and greeted me as I got out of my car. We exchanged social courtesies for a while, and then, in plain terms, I confessed that I'd been very devious with him the first time we'd met. I'd boasted that I knew a great deal about peyote, when in reality I knew nothing about it. He stared at me. His eyes were very kind. I told him that for 6 months I'd been reading to prepare myself for our meeting, and that this time I really knew a great deal more. He laughed. Obviously, there was something in my statement which was funny to him. He was laughing at me, and I felt a bit confused and offended. He apparently noticed my discomfort and assured me that, although I had had good intentions, there was really no way to prepare myself for our meeting. I wondered if it would have been proper to ask whether that statement had any hidden meaning, but I didn't. Yet he seemed to be attuned to my feelings, and proceeded to explain what he had meant. He said that my endeavors reminded him of a story about some people a certain king had persecuted and killed once upon a time. He said that in the story the persecuted people were indistinguishable from their persecutors, except that they insisted on pronouncing certain words in a peculiar manner proper only to them. That flaw, of course, was the giveaway. The king posted roadblocks at critical points where an official would ask every man passing by to pronounce a key word. Those who could pronounce it the way the king pronounced it would live, but those who couldn't were immediately put to death. The point of the story was that one day a young man decided to prepare himself for passing the roadblock by learning to pronounce the test word just as the king liked it. Don Juan said, with a broad smile, that in fact it took the young man 6 months to master such a pronunciation. And then came the day of the great test. The young man very confidently came upon the roadblock and waited for the official to ask him to pronounce the word. At that point, Don Juan very dramatically stopped his recounting and looked at me. His pause was very studied and seemed a bit corny to me, but I played along. I'd heard the theme of the story before. It had to do with Jews in Germany, and the way one could tell who was a Jew by the way they pronounced certain words. I also knew the punchline. The young man was going to get caught because the official had forgotten the key word and asked him to pronounce another word, which was very similar, but which the young man had not learned to say correctly. Don Juan seemed to be waiting for me to ask what happened, so I did. "What happened to him?" I asked, trying to sound naive and interested in the story. "The young man, who was truly foxy," he said, "realized that the official had forgotten the key word, and before the man could say anything else, he confessed that he had prepared himself for 6 months. He made another pause and looked at me with a mischievous glint in his eyes. This time, he had turned the tables on me. The young man's confession was a new element, and I no longer knew how the story would end. "Well, what happened then?" I asked, truly interested. "The young man was killed instantly, of course," he said, and broke into a roaring laughter. I liked very much the way he'd entrapped my interest. Above all, I liked the way he had linked that story to my own case. In fact, he seemed to have constructed it to fit me. He was making fun of me in a very subtle and artistic manner. I laughed with him. Afterwards, I told him that no matter how stupid I sounded, I was really interested in learning something about plants. "I like to walk a great deal," he said. I thought he was deliberately changing the topic of conversation to avoid answering me. I didn't want to antagonize him with my insistence. He asked me if I wanted to go with him on a short hike in the desert. I eagerly told him that I would love to walk in the desert. "This is no picnic," he said, in a tone of warning. I told him that I wanted very seriously to work with him. I said that I needed information, any kind of information, on the uses of medicinal herbs, and that I was willing to pay him for his time and effort. "You'll be working for me," I said, "and I'll pay you wages." "How much would you pay me?" he asked. I detected a note of greed in his voice. "Whatever you think is appropriate," I said. "Pay me for my time with your time," he said. I thought he was a most peculiar fellow. I told him I didn't understand what he meant. He replied that there was nothing to say about plants. Thus, to take my money would be unthinkable for him. He looked at me piercingly. "What are you doing in your pocket?" he asked, frowning. "Are you playing with your wanger?" He was referring to my taking notes on a minute pad inside the enormous pockets of my windbreaker. When I told him what I was doing, he laughed heartily. I said that I didn't want to disturb him by writing in front of him. "If you want to write, write," he said. "You don't disturb me." We hiked in the surrounding desert until it was almost dark. He didn't show me any plants, nor did he talk about them at all. We stopped for a moment to rest by some large bushes. "Plants are very peculiar things," he said, without looking at me. "They are alive, and they feel." At the very moment he made that statement, a strong gust of wind shook the desert chaparral around us. The bushes made a rattling noise. "Do you hear that?" he asked me, putting his right hand to his ear as if he were aiding his hearing. "The leaves and the wind are agreeing with me." I laughed. The friend who had put us in contact had already told me to watch out because the old man was very eccentric. I thought the agreement with the leaves was one of his eccentricities. We walked for a while longer, but he still didn't show me any plants, nor did he pick any of them. He simply breezed through the bushes, touching them gently. Then he came to a halt and sat down on a rock and told me to rest and look around. I insisted on talking. Once more, I let him know that I wanted very much to learn about plants, especially peyote. I pleaded with him to become my informant in exchange for some sort of monetary reward. "You don't have to pay me," he said. "You can ask me anything you want. I'll tell you what I know, and then I'll tell you what to do with it." He asked me if I agreed with the arrangement. I was delighted. Then he added a cryptic statement. "Perhaps there's nothing to learn about plants, because there's nothing to say about them." I didn't understand what he'd said, or what he'd meant by it. "What did you say?" I asked. He repeated the statement 3 times, and then the whole area was shaken by the roar of an Air Force jet flying low. "There! The world has just agreed with me," he said, putting his left hand to his ear. I found him very amusing. His laughter was contagious. "Are you from Arizona, Don Juan?" I asked, in an effort to keep the conversation centered around his being my informant. He looked at me and nodded affirmatively. His eyes seemed to be tired. I could see the white underneath his pupils. "Were you born in this locality?" He nodded his head again, without answering me. It seemed to be an affirmative gesture, but it also seemed to be the nervous headshake of a person who's thinking. "And where are you from, yourself?" he asked. "I come from South America," I said. "That's a big place. Do you come from all of it?" His eyes were piercing again as he looked at me. I began to explain the circumstances of my birth, but he interrupted me. "We're alike in this respect," he said. "I live here now, but I'm really a Yaqui from Sonora." "Is that so? I myself come from—" He didn't let me finish. I know, he said. "You are who you are, from wherever you are, as I am a Yaqui from Sonora." His eyes were very shiny, and his laughter was strangely unsettling. He made me feel as if he'd caught me in a lie. I experienced a peculiar sensation of guilt. I had the feeling he knew something I didn't know, or didn't want to tell. My strange embarrassment grew. He must have noticed it, for he stood up and asked me if I wanted to go eat in a restaurant in town. Walking back to his home and then driving into town made me feel better, but I wasn't quite relaxed. I somehow felt threatened, although I couldn't pinpoint the reason. I wanted to buy him some beer in the restaurant. He said that he never drank, not even beer. I laughed to myself. I didn't believe him. The friend who had put us in contact had told me that the old man was plastered out of his mind most of the time. I really didn't mind if he was lying to me about not drinking. I liked him. There was something very soothing about his person. I must have had a look of doubt on my face, for he then went on to explain that he used to drink in his youth, but that one day he simply dropped it. "People hardly ever realize that we can cut anything from our lives, any time, just like that." He snapped his fingers. "Do you think that one can stop smoking or drinking that easily?" I asked. "Sure," he said, with great conviction. "Smoking and drinking are nothing. Nothing at all, if we want to drop them." At that very moment, the water that was boiling in the coffee percolator made a loud perking sound. "Hear that?" Don Juan exclaimed with a shine in his eyes. "The boiling water agrees with me." Then he added after a pause, "A man can get agreements from everything around him." At that crucial instant, the coffee percolator made a truly obscene gurgling sound. He looked at the percolator and softly said, "Thank you," nodded his head, and then broke into a roaring laughter. I was taken aback. His laughter was a bit too loud, but I was genuinely amused by it all. My first real session with my informant ended then. He said goodbye at the door of the restaurant. I told him I had to visit some friends and that I would like to see him again at the end of the following week. "When will you be home?" I asked. He scrutinized me. "Whenever you come," he replied. "I don't know exactly when I can come." "Just come then, and don't worry." "What if you're not in?" "I'll be there," he said, smiling, and walked away. I ran after him and asked him if he would mind my bringing a camera with me to take pictures of him in his house. "That's out of the question," he said, with a frown. "How about a tape recorder? Would you mind that?" "I'm afraid there's no possibility of that either." I became annoyed and began to fret. I said I saw no logical reason for his refusal. Don Juan shook his head negatively. "Forget it," he said forcefully, "and if you still want to see me, don't ever mention it again." I staged a weak final complaint. I said that pictures and recordings were indispensable to my work. He said that there was only one thing which was indispensable for anything we did. He called it the spirit. "One can't do without the spirit," he said, "and you don't have it. Worry about that, and not about pictures." "What do you—" He interrupted me with a movement of his hand, and walked backwards a few steps. "Be sure to come back," he said softly, and waved goodbye. 2. Erasing Personal History. Thursday, December 22nd, 1960. Don Juan was sitting on the floor by the door of his house, with his back against the wall. He turned over a wooden milk crate and asked me to sit down and make myself at home. I offered him some cigarettes. I had brought a carton of them. He said he didn't smoke, but he accepted the gift. We talked about the coldness of the desert nights and other ordinary topics of conversation. I asked him if I was interfering with his normal routine. He looked at me with a sort of frown and said he had no routines, and that I could stay with him all afternoon if I wanted to. I'd prepared some genealogy and kinship charts that I wanted to fill out with his help. I'd also compiled, from the ethnographic literature, a long list of culture traits that were purported to belong to the Indians of the area. I wanted to go through the list with him and mark all the items that were familiar to him. I began with the kinship charts. "What did you call your father?" I asked. "I called him Dad," he said with a very serious face. I felt a little bit annoyed, but I proceeded on the assumption that he hadn't understood. I showed him the chart and explained that one space was for the father and another space was for the mother. I gave as an example the different words used in English and in Spanish for father and mother. I thought that perhaps I should have taken mother first. "What did you call your mother?" I asked. "I called her Mom," he replied in a naive tone. "I mean, what other words did you use to call your father and mother? How did you call them?" I said, trying to be patient and polite. He scratched his head and looked at me with a stupid expression. "Golly," he said, "you got me there. Let me think." After a moment's hesitation, he seemed to remember something, and I got ready to write. "Well," he said, as if he were involved in serious thought, "how else did I call them? I called them, 'Hey, hey, Dad! Hey, hey, Mom!'" I laughed against my desire. His expression was truly comical, and at that moment I didn't know whether he was a preposterous old man pulling my leg or whether he was really a simpleton. Using all the patience I had, I explained to him that these were very serious questions, and that it was very important for my work to fill out the forms. I tried to make him understand the idea of a genealogy and personal history. "What were the names of your father and mother?" I asked. He looked at me with clear, kind eyes. "Don't waste your time with that crap," he said softly, but with unsuspected force. I didn't know what to say. It was as if someone else had uttered those words. A moment before, he had been a fumbling, stupid Indian scratching his head, and then, in an instant, he'd reversed the roles. I was the stupid one, and he was staring at me with an indescribable look that wasn't a look of arrogance or defiance or hatred or contempt. His eyes were kind and clear and penetrating. "I don't have any personal history," he said after a long pause. "One day, I found out that personal history was no longer necessary for me. And like drinking, I dropped it." I didn't quite understand what he meant by that. I suddenly felt ill at ease, threatened. I reminded him that he'd assured me that it was all right to ask him questions. He reiterated that he didn't mind at all. "I don't have personal history anymore," he said, and looked at me probingly. "I dropped it one day, when I felt it was no longer necessary." I stared at him, trying to detect the hidden meanings of his words. "How can one drop one's personal history?" I asked in an argumentative mood. "One must first have the desire to drop it," he said, "and then one must proceed harmoniously to chop it off, little by little." Why should anyone have such a desire? I exclaimed. I had a terribly strong attachment to my personal history. My family roots were deep. I honestly felt that without them, my life had no continuity or purpose. Perhaps you should tell me what you mean by dropping one's personal history, I said. To do away with it, that's what I mean, he replied cuttingly. I insisted that I mustn't have understood the proposition. Take you, for instance, I said. You are a Yaqui. You can't change that. Am I? He asked, smiling. How do you know that? True, I said. I can't know that with certainty at this point, but you know it. And that's what counts. That's what makes it personal history. I felt I'd driven a hard nail in. The fact that I know whether I'm a Yaqui or not doesn't make it personal history, he replied. Only when someone else knows that does it become personal history, and I assure you that no one will ever know that for sure. I'd written down what he'd said in a clumsy way. I stopped writing and looked at him. I couldn't figure him out. I mentally ran through my impressions of him. The mysterious and unprecedented way he'd looked at me during our first meeting, the charm with which he'd claimed that he received agreement from everything around him, his annoying humor and his alertness, his look of bona fide stupidity when I asked about his father and mother, and then the unsuspected force of his statements which had snapped me apart. You don't know what I am, do you? He said, as if he were reading my thoughts. You will never know who or what I am, because I don't have a personal history. He asked me if I had a father. I told him I did. He said that my father was an example of what he had in mind. He urged me to remember what my father thought of me. Your father knows everything about you, he said. So he has you all figured out. He knows who you are and what you do, and there's no power on earth that can make him change his mind about you. Don Juan said that everybody that knew me had an idea about me, and that I kept feeding the idea with everything I did. Don't you see? He asked dramatically. You must renew your personal history by telling your parents, your relatives, and your friends everything you do. On the other hand, if you have no personal history, no explanations are needed. Nobody is angry or disillusioned with your acts, and above all, no one pins you down with their thoughts. Suddenly, the idea became clear in my mind. I'd almost known it myself, but I'd never examined it. Not having personal history was indeed an appealing concept, at least on the intellectual level. It gave me, however, a sense of loneliness, which I found threatening and distasteful. I wanted to discuss my feelings with him, but I kept myself in check. Something was terribly incongruous in the situation at hand. I felt ridiculous trying to get into a philosophical argument with an old Indian who obviously didn't have the sophistication of a university student. Somehow, he had led me away from my original intention of asking him about his genealogy. I don't know how we ended up talking about this, when all I wanted was some names for my charts, I said, trying to steer the conversation back to the topic I wanted. It's terribly simple, he said. The way we ended up talking about it was because I said that to ask questions about one's past is a bunch of crap. His tone was firm. I felt there was no way to make him budge, so I changed my tactics. Is this idea of not having personal history something that the Yaquis do? I asked. It's something that I do. Where did you learn it? I learned it during the course of my life. Did your father teach you that? No. Let's say that I learned it by myself, and now I'm going to give you its secret, so you won't go away empty-handed today. He lowered his voice to a dramatic whisper. I laughed at his histrionics. I had to admit that he was stupendous at that. The thought crossed my mind that I was in the presence of a born actor. "Write it down," he said patronizingly. "Why not? You seem to be more comfortable writing." I looked at him, and my eyes must have betrayed my confusion. He slapped his thighs and laughed with great delight. "It's best to erase all personal history," he said slowly, as if giving me time to write it down in my clumsy way, "because that would make us free from the encumbering thoughts of other people." I couldn't believe that he was actually saying that. I had a very confusing moment. He must have read in my face my inner turmoil and used it immediately. "Take yourself, for instance," he went on saying. "Right now, you don't know whether you're coming or going. And that is so because I have erased my personal history. I have little by little created a fog around me and my life. And now, nobody knows for sure who I am or what I do." "But you yourself know who you are, don't you?" I interjected. "You bet I don't," he exclaimed, and rolled on the floor, laughing at my surprised look. He'd paused long enough to make me believe that he was going to say that he did know, as I was anticipating it. His subterfuge was very threatening to me. I actually became afraid. "That is the little secret I'm going to give you today," he said in a low voice. "Nobody knows my personal history. Nobody knows who I am or what I do. Not even I." He squinted his eyes. He wasn't looking at me, but beyond me, over my right shoulder. He was sitting cross-legged, his back was straight, and yet he seemed to be so relaxed. At that moment, he was the very picture of fierceness. I fancied him to be an Indian chief, a red-skinned warrior in the romantic frontier sagas of my childhood. My romanticism carried me away, and the most insidious feeling of ambivalence enveloped me. I could sincerely say that I liked him a great deal, and in the same breath, I could say that I was deadly afraid of him. He maintained that strange stare for a long moment. "How can I know who I am when I am all this?" he said, sweeping the surroundings with a gesture of his head. Then he glanced at me and smiled. "Little by little, you must create a fog around yourself. You must erase everything around you until nothing can be taken for granted, until nothing is any longer for sure or real. Your problem now is that you're too real. Your endeavors are too real. Your moods are too real. Don't take things so for granted. You must begin to erase yourself." "What for?" I asked belligerently. It became clear to me then that he was prescribing behavior for me. All my life, I'd reached a breaking point when someone attempted to tell me what to do. The mere thought of being told what to do put me immediately on the defensive. "You said that you wanted to learn about plants?" he said calmly. "Do you want to get something for nothing? What do you think this is? We agreed that you would ask me questions, and I'd tell you what I know. If you don't like it, there's nothing else we can say to each other." His terrible directness made me feel peeved, and begrudgingly, I conceded that he was right. "Let's put it this way, then," he went on. "If you want to learn about plants, since there's really nothing to say about them, You must, among other things, erase your personal history. How? I asked. Begin with simple things, such as not revealing what you really do. Then you must leave everyone who knows you well. This way, you'll build up a fog around yourself. But that's absurd, I protested. Why shouldn't people know me? What's wrong with that? What's wrong is that once they know you, you're an affair take it for granted, and from that moment on, you won't be able to break the tie of their thoughts. I personally like the ultimate freedom of being unknown. No one knows me with steadfast certainty, the way people know you, for instance. But that would be lying. I'm not concerned with lies or truths, he said severely. Lies are lies only if you have personal history. I argued that I didn't like to deliberately mystify people or mislead them. His reply was that I misled everybody anyway. The old man had touched a sore spot in my life. I didn't pause to ask him what he meant by that or how he knew that I mystified people all the time. I simply reacted to his statement, defending myself by means of an explanation. I said that I was painfully aware that my family and friends believed I was unreliable, when in reality I'd never told a lie in my life. You always knew how to lie, he said. The only thing that was missing was that you didn't know why to do it. Now you do. I protested. Don't you see that I'm really sick and tired of people thinking that I'm unreliable? I said. But you are unreliable, he replied with conviction. Damn it to hell, man, I am not, I exclaimed. My mood, instead of forcing him into seriousness, made him laugh hysterically. I really despised the old man for all his cockiness. Unfortunately, he was right about me. After a while, I calmed down, and he continued talking. When one doesn't have personal history, he explained, nothing that one says can be taken for a lie. Your trouble is that you have to explain everything to everybody, compulsively. And at the same time, you want to keep the freshness, the newness of what you do. Well, since you can't be excited after explaining everything you've done, you lie in order to keep on going. I was truly bewildered by the scope of our conversation. I wrote down all the details of our exchange in the best way I could, concentrating on what he was saying, rather than pausing to deliberate on my prejudices or on his meanings. From now on, he said, you must simply show people whatever you care to show them, but without ever telling exactly how you've done it. I can't keep secrets, I exclaimed. What you're saying is useless to me. Then change, he said cuttingly, and with a fierce glint in his eyes. He looked like a strange, wild animal, and yet he was so coherent in his thoughts and so verbal. My annoyance gave way to a state of irritating confusion. You see, he went on, we only have two alternatives. We either take everything for sure and real, or we don't. If we follow the first, we end up bored to death with ourselves and with the world. If we follow the second, and erase personal history, we create a fog around us, a very exciting and mysterious state in which nobody knows where the rabbit will pop out. Not even ourselves. I contended that erasing personal history would only increase our sensation of insecurity. When nothing is for sure, we remain alert, perennially on our toes, he said. It's more exciting not to know which bush the rabbit is hiding behind than to behave as though we know everything. He didn't say another word for a very long time. Perhaps an hour went by in complete silence. I didn't know what to ask. Finally, he got up and asked me to drive him to the nearby town. I didn't know why, but our conversation had drained me. I felt like going to sleep. He asked me to stop on the way and told me that if I wanted to relax, I had to climb to the flat top of a small hill on the side of the road and lie down on my stomach with my head towards the east. He seemed to have a feeling of urgency. I didn't want to argue, or perhaps I was too tired to even speak. I climbed the hill and did as he had prescribed. I slept only 2 or 3 minutes, but it was sufficient to have my energy renewed. We drove to the center of town, where he told me to let him off. "Come back," he said, as he stepped out of the car. "Be sure to come back." 3. Losing self-importance. I had the opportunity of discussing my 2 previous visits to Don Juan with the friend who had put us in contact. It was his opinion that I was wasting my time. I related to him in every detail the scope of our conversation. He thought I was exaggerating and romanticizing, a silly old fogey. There was very little room in me for romanticizing such a preposterous old man. I sincerely felt that his criticism about my personality had seriously undermined my liking him. Yet I had to admit that they had always been apropos, sharply delineated, and true to the letter. The crux of my dilemma at that point was my unwillingness to accept that Don Juan was very capable of disrupting all my preconceptions about the world, and my unwillingness to agree with my friend, who believed that the old Indian was just nuts. I felt compelled to pay him another visit before I made up my mind. Wednesday, December 28th, 1960. Immediately after I arrived at his house, he took me for a walk in the desert chaparral. He didn't even look at the bag of groceries that I brought him. He seemed to have been waiting for me. We walked for hours. He didn't collect or show me any plants. He did, however, teach me an appropriate form of walking. He said that I had to curl my fingers gently as I walked, so I would keep my attention on the trail and the surroundings. He claimed that my ordinary way of walking was debilitating, and that one should never carry anything in the hands. If things had to be carried, one should use a knapsack, or any sort of carrying net or shoulder bag. His idea was that by forcing the hands into a specific position, one was capable of greater stamina and greater awareness. I saw no point in arguing and curled my fingers as he had prescribed and kept on walking. My awareness was in no way different, nor was my stamina. We started our hike in the morning and we stopped to rest around noon. I was perspiring and tried to drink from my canteen, but he stopped me by saying that it was better to have only a sip of water. He cut some leaves from a small yellowish bush and chewed them. He gave me some and remarked that they were excellent, and if I chewed them slowly, my thirst would vanish. It didn't, but I wasn't uncomfortable either. He seemed to have read my thoughts and explained that I hadn't felt the benefits of the right way of walking, or the benefits of chewing the leaves, because I was young and strong, and my body didn't notice anything, because it was a bit stupid. He laughed. I wasn't in a laughing mood, and that seemed to amuse him even more. He corrected his previous statement, saying that my body wasn't really stupid, but somehow dormant. At that moment, an enormous crow flew right over us, cawing. That startled me, and I began to laugh. I thought that the occasion called for laughter, but to my utter amazement, he shook my arm vigorously and hushed me up. He had a most serious expression. "That wasn't a joke," he said severely, as if I knew what he was talking about. I asked for an explanation. I told him that it was incongruous that my laughing at the crow had made him angry when we had laughed at the coffee percolator. "What you saw was not just a crow," he exclaimed. But I saw it, and it was a crow, I insisted. You saw nothing, you fool, he said in a gruff voice. His rudeness was uncalled for. I told him that I didn't like to make people angry and that perhaps it would be better if I left, since he didn't seem to be in a mood to have company. He laughed uproariously, as if I were a clown performing for him. My annoyance and embarrassment grew in proportion. You're very violent, he commented casually. You're taking yourself too seriously. But weren't you doing the same? I interjected. Taking yourself seriously when you got angry at me? He said that to get angry at me was the farthest thing from his mind. He looked at me piercingly. What you saw was not an agreement from the world, he said. Crows flying or cawing are never an agreement. That was an omen. An omen of what? A very important indication about you, he replied cryptically. At that very instant, the wind blew the dry branch of a bush right to our feet. That was an agreement, he exclaimed, and looked at me with shiny eyes and broke into a belly laugh. I had the feeling that he was teasing me by making up the rules of his strange game as we went along. Thus, it was all right for him to laugh, but not for me. My annoyance mushroomed again, and I told him what I thought of him. He wasn't cross or offended at all. He laughed, and his laughter caused me even more anguish and frustration. I thought that he was deliberately humiliating me. I decided right then that I had had my fill of field work. I stood up and said that I wanted to start walking back to his house because I had to leave for Los Angeles. Sit down, he said imperatively. You get peeved like an old lady. You can't leave now, because we're not through yet. I hated him. I thought he was a contemptuous man. He began to sing an idiotic Mexican folk song. He was obviously imitating some popular singer. He elongated certain syllables and contracted others, and made the song into a most farcical affair. It was so comical that I ended up laughing. You see? You laugh at the stupid song, he said. But the man who sings it that way, and those who pay to listen to him, aren't laughing. They think it's serious. What do you mean? I asked. I thought he'd deliberately concocted the example to tell me that I'd laughed at the crow because I hadn't taken it seriously, the same way I hadn't taken the song seriously. But he baffled me again. He said I was like the singer and the people who liked his songs, conceited and deadly serious about some nonsense that no one in his right mind should give a damn about. He then recapitulated, as if to refresh my memory, all he had said before on the topic of learning about plants. He stressed emphatically that if I really wanted to learn, I had to remodel most of my behavior. My sense of annoyance grew, until I had to make a supreme effort to even take notes. You take yourself too seriously, he said slowly. You're too damn important in your own mind. That must be changed. You're so goddamn important that you feel justified to be annoyed with everything. You're so damn important that you can afford to leave if things don't go your way. I suppose you think that shows you have character. That's nonsense. You're weak and conceited. I tried to stage a protest, but he didn't budge. He pointed out that in the course of my life, I hadn't ever finished anything because of that sense of disproportionate importance that I attached to myself. I was flabbergasted at the certainty with which he made his statements. They were true, of course, and that made me feel not only angry, but also threatened. Self-importance is another thing that must be dropped, just like personal history, he said, in a dramatic tone. I certainly didn't want to argue with him. It was obvious that I was at a terrible disadvantage. He wasn't going to walk back to his house until he was ready, and I didn't know the way. I had to stay with him. He made a strange and sudden movement. He sort of sniffed the air around him. His head shook slightly and rhythmically. He seemed to be in a state of unusual alertness. He turned and stared at me with a look of bewilderment and curiosity. His eyes swept up and down my body as if he were looking for something specific. Then he stood up abruptly and began to walk fast. He was almost running. I followed him. He kept a very accelerated pace for nearly an hour. Finally, he stopped by a rocky hill, and we sat in the shade of a bush. The trotting had exhausted me completely, although my mood was better. It was strange, the way I had changed. I felt almost elated. But when we had started to trot after our argument, I was furious with him. "This is very weird," I said, "but I feel really good." I heard the cawing of a crow in the distance. He lifted his finger to his right ear and smiled. "That was an omen," he said. A small rock tumbled downhill and made a crashing sound when it landed in the chaparral. He laughed out loud and pointed his finger to the direction of the sound. "And that was an agreement," he said. He then asked me if I was ready to talk about my self-importance. I laughed. My feeling of anger seemed so far away that I couldn't even conceive how I'd become so cross with him. "I can't understand what's happening to me," I said. "I got angry, and now I don't know why I'm not angry anymore." "The world around us is very mysterious," he said. "It doesn't yield its secrets easily." I liked his cryptic statements. They were challenging and mysterious. I couldn't determine whether they were filled with hidden meanings or whether they were just plain nonsense. "If you ever come back to the desert here," he said, "stay away from that rocky hill where we stopped today. Avoid it like the plague." "Why, what's the matter?" "This isn't the time to explain it," he said. "Now, we are concerned with losing self-importance. As long as you feel that you're the most important thing in the world, you can't really appreciate the world around you. You're like a horse with blinders. All you see is yourself, apart from everything else." He examined me for a moment. "I'm going to talk to my little friend here," he said, pointing to a small plant. He kneeled in front of it and began to caress it and to talk to it. I didn't understand what he was saying at first, but then he switched languages and talked to the plant in Spanish. He babbled inanities for a while. Then he stood up. "It doesn't matter what you say to a plant," he said. "You can just as well make up words. What's important is the feeling of liking it and treating it as an equal." He explained that a man who gathers plants must apologize every time for taking them, and must assure them that someday his own body will serve as food for them. "So, all in all, the plants and ourselves are even," he said. "Neither we nor they are more or less important." "Come on, talk to the little plant," he urged me. "Tell it that you don't feel important anymore." I went as far as kneeling in front of the plant, but I couldn't bring myself to speak to it. I felt ridiculous, and laughed. I wasn't angry, however. Don Juan patted me on the back and said that it was all right, that at least I'd contained my temper. "From now on, talk to the little plants," he said. "Talk until you lose all sense of importance. Talk to them until you can do it in front of others. Go to those hills over there and practice by yourself." I asked if it was all right to talk to the plants silently, in my mind. He laughed and tapped my head. "No," he said. "You must talk to them in a loud and clear voice if you want them to answer you." I walked to the area in question laughing to myself about his eccentricities. I even tried to talk to the plants, but my feeling of being ludicrous was overpowering. After what I thought was an appropriate wait, I went back to where Don Juan was. I had the certainty that he knew I hadn't talked to the plants. He didn't look at me. He signaled me to sit down by him. "Watch me carefully," he said. "I'm going to have a talk with my little friend." He kneeled down in front of a small plant, and for a few minutes he moved and contorted his body, talking and laughing. I thought he was out of his mind. "This little plant told me to tell you that she is good to eat," he said as he got up from his kneeling position. "She said that a handful of them would keep a man healthy. She also said that there's a batch of them growing over there." Don Juan pointed to an area on a hillside perhaps 200 yards away. "Let's go and find out," he said. I laughed at his histrionics. I was sure we would find the plants because he was an expert in the terrain and knew where the edible and medicinal plants were. As we walked towards the area in question, he told me casually that I should take notice of the plant, because it was both a food and a medicine. I asked him, half in jest, if the plant had just told him that. He stopped walking and examined me with an air of disbelief. He shook his head from side to side. "Ah!" he exclaimed, laughing. "Your cleverness makes you more silly than I thought. How can the little plant tell me now what I've known all my life?" He proceeded then to explain that he knew all along the different properties of that specific plant, and that the plant had just told him that there was a batch of them growing in the area he had pointed to, and that she didn't mind if he told me that. Upon arriving at the hillside, I found a whole cluster of the same plants. I wanted to laugh, but he didn't give me time. He wanted me to thank the batch of plants. I felt excruciatingly self-conscious and couldn't bring myself to do it. He smiled benevolently and made another of his cryptic statements. He repeated it 3 or 4 times, as if to give me time to figure out its meaning. "The world around us is a mystery," he said. "And men are no better than anything else. If a little plant is generous with us, we must thank her. Or perhaps she will not let us go." The way he looked at me when he said that gave me a chill. I hurriedly leaned over the plants and said, "Thank you," in a loud voice. He began to laugh in controlled and quiet spurts. We walked for another hour and then started on our way back to his house. At a certain time, I dropped behind and he had to wait for me. He checked my fingers to see if I had curled them. I had not. He told me imperatively that whenever I walked with him, I had to observe and copy his mannerisms or not come along at all. "I can't be waiting for you as though you're a child," he said in a scolding tone. That statement sunk me into the depths of embarrassment and bewilderment. How could it be possible that such an old man could walk so much better than I? I thought I was athletic and strong, and yet he had actually had to wait for me to catch up with him. I curled my fingers, and strangely enough, I was able to keep his tremendous pace without any effort. In fact, at times, I felt that my hands were pulling me forward. I felt elated. I was quite happy walking inanely with the strange old Indian. I began to talk and asked repeatedly if he would show me some peyote plants. He looked at me, but didn't say a word. 4. Death is an advisor. Wednesday, January 25th, 1961. "Would you teach me someday about peyote?" I asked. He didn't answer, and as he had done before, simply looked at me as if I were crazy. I had mentioned the topic to him in casual conversation various times already, and every time he frowned and shook his head. It wasn't an affirmative or a negative gesture. It was rather a gesture of despair and disbelief. He stood up abruptly. We'd been sitting on the ground in front of his house. An almost imperceptible shake of his head was the invitation to follow him. We went into the desert chaparral in a southerly direction. He mentioned repeatedly as we walked that I had to be aware of the uselessness of my self-importance and of my personal history. "Your friends," he said, turning to me abruptly. "Those who have known you for a long time, you must leave them quickly." I thought he was crazy, and his insistence was idiotic, but I didn't say anything. He peered at me and began to laugh. After a long hike, we came to a halt. I was about to sit down to rest, but he told me to go some 20 yards away and talk to a batch of plants in a loud and clear voice. I felt ill at ease and apprehensive. His weird demands were more than I could bear, and I told him once more that I couldn't speak to plants because I felt ridiculous. His only comment was that my feeling of self-importance was immense. He seemed to have made a sudden decision and said that I shouldn't try to talk to plants until I felt easy and natural about it. "You want to learn about them, and yet you don't want to do any work," he said accusingly. "What are you trying to do?" My explanation was that I wanted bona fide information about the uses of plants. Thus, I'd asked him to be my informant. I'd even offered to pay him for his time and trouble. "You should take the money," I said. "This way we both would feel better. I could then ask you anything I want to, because you would be working for me, and I would pay you for it. What do you think of that?" He looked at me contemptuously, and made an obscene sound with his mouth, making his lower lip and his tongue vibrate by exhaling with great force. "That's what I think of it," he said, and laughed hysterically at the look of utmost surprise that I must have had on my face. It was obvious to me that he wasn't a man I could easily contend with. In spite of his age, he was ebullient and unbelievably strong. I had had the idea that, being so old, he could have been the perfect informant for me. Old people, I had been led to believe, made the best informants because they were too feeble to do anything else except talk. Don Juan, on the other hand, was a miserable subject. I felt he was unmanageable and dangerous. The friend who had introduced us was right. He was an eccentric old Indian, and although he wasn't plastered out of his mind most of the time, as my friend had told me, he was worse yet. He was crazy. I again felt the terrible doubt and apprehension I had experienced before. I thought I had overcome that. In fact, I had had no trouble at all convincing myself that I wanted to visit him again. The idea had crept into my mind, however, that perhaps I was a bit crazy myself when I realized that I liked to be with him. His idea that my feeling of self-importance was an obstacle had really made an impact on me. But all that was apparently only an intellectual exercise on my part. The moment I was confronted with his odd behavior, I began to experience apprehension, and I wanted to leave. I said that I believed we were so different that there was no possibility of our getting along. "One of us has to change," he said, staring at the ground. "And you know who." He began humming a Mexican folk song, and then lifted his head abruptly and looked at me. His eyes were fierce and burning. I wanted to look away or close my eyes, but to my utter amazement I couldn't break away from his gaze. He asked me to tell him what I had seen in his eyes. I said that I saw nothing, but he insisted that I had to voice what his eyes had made me feel aware of. I struggled to make him understand that the only thing his eyes made me aware of was my embarrassment, and that the way he was looking at me was very discomforting. He didn't let go. He kept a steady stare. It wasn't an outright menacing or mean look, it was rather a mysterious but unpleasant gaze. He asked me if he reminded me of a bird. "A bird?" I exclaimed. He giggled like a child and moved his eyes away from me. "Yes," he said softly. "A bird. A very funny bird." He locked his gaze on me again and commanded me to remember. He said, with an extraordinary conviction, that he knew I had seen that look before. My feelings of the moment were that the old man provoked me, against my honest desire, every time he opened his mouth. I stared back at him in obvious defiance. Instead of getting angry, he began to laugh. He slapped his thigh and yelled as if he were riding a wild horse. Then he became serious and told me that it was of utmost importance that I stop fighting him and remember that funny bird he was talking about. "Look into my eyes," he said. His eyes were extraordinarily fierce. There was a feeling about them that actually reminded me of something, but I wasn't sure what it was. I pondered upon it for a moment, and then I had a sudden realization. It wasn't the shape of his eyes, nor the shape of his head, but some cold fierceness in his gaze that had reminded me of the look in the eyes of a falcon. At the very moment of that realization, he was looking at me askew, and for an instant my mind experienced a total chaos. I thought I had seen a falcon's features instead of Don Juan's. The image was too fleeting, and I was too upset to have paid more attention to it. In a very excited tone, I told him that I could have sworn I had seen the features of a falcon on his face. He had another attack of laughter. "I have seen the look in the eyes of falcons. I used to hunt them when I was a boy, and in the opinion of my grandfather, I was good. He had a Leghorn chicken farm, and falcons were a menace to his business. Shooting them was not only functional, but also right. I had forgotten until that moment that the fierceness of their eyes had haunted me for years, but it was so far in my past that I thought I had lost the memory of it. "I used to hunt falcons," I said. "I know it," Don Juan replied, matter-of-factly. His tone carried such a certainty that I began to laugh. I thought he was a preposterous fellow. He had the gall to sound as if he knew I had hunted falcons. I felt supremely contemptuous of him. "Why do you get so angry?" he asked in a tone of genuine concern. I didn't know why. He began to probe me in a very unusual manner. He asked me to look at him again and tell him about the very funny bird he reminded me of. I struggled against him and, out of contempt, said that there was nothing to talk about. Then I felt compelled to ask him why he had said he knew I used to hunt falcons. Instead of answering me, he again commented on my behavior. He said I was a violent fellow that was capable of frothing at the mouth at the drop of a hat. I protested that that was not true. I had always had the idea I was rather congenial and easygoing. I said it was his fault for forcing me out of control with his unexpected words and actions. "Why the anger?" he asked. I took stock of my feelings and reactions. I really had no need to be angry with him. He again insisted that I should look into his eyes and tell him about the strange falcon. He had changed his wording. He had said before, "a very funny bird." Then he substituted it with "strange falcon." The change in wording summed up a change in my own mood. I had suddenly become sad. He squinted his eyes until they were two slits and said in an overdramatic voice that he was seeing a very strange falcon. He repeated his statement 3 times as if he were actually seeing it there in front of him. "Don't you remember it?" he asked. I didn't remember anything of the sort. "What's strange about the falcon?" I asked. "You must tell me that," he replied. I insisted that I had no way of knowing what he was referring to, therefore I couldn't tell him anything. "Don't fight me," he said. "Fight your sluggishness, and remember." I seriously struggled for a moment to figure him out. It didn't occur to me that I could just as well have tried to remember. "There was a time when you saw a lot of birds," he said, as though cueing me. I told him that when I was a child I had lived on a farm and had hunted hundreds of birds. He said that if that was the case I shouldn't have any difficulty remembering all the funny birds I had hunted. He looked at me with a question in his eyes, as if he had just given me the last clue. "I've hunted so many birds," I said, "that I can't remember anything about them." "This bird is special," he replied, almost in a whisper. "This bird is a falcon." I became involved again in figuring out what he was driving at. Was he teasing me? Was he serious? After a long interval, he urged me again to remember. I felt that it was useless for me to try to end his play. The only other thing I could do was to join him. "Are you talking about a falcon that I have hunted?" I asked. "Yes," he whispered, with his eyes closed. "So this happened when I was a boy?" "Yes." "But you said you're seeing a falcon in front of you now." "I am." "What are you trying to do to me?" "I'm trying to make you remember." "What, for heaven's sakes?" "A falcon swift as light," he said, looking at me in the eyes. I felt my heart had stopped. "Now look at me," he said. But I didn't. I heard his voice as a faint sound. Some stupendous recollection had taken me wholly. The white falcon. It all began with my grandfather's explosion of anger upon taking account of his young Leghorn chickens. They had been disappearing in a steady and disconcerting manner. He personally organized and carried out a meticulous vigil, and after days of steady watching, we finally saw a big white bird flying away with a young Leghorn chicken in its claws. The bird was fast and apparently knew its route. It swooped down from behind some trees, grabbed the chicken, and flew away through an opening between two ranches. It happened so fast that my grandfather had hardly seen it, but I did, and I knew that it was indeed a falcon. My grandfather said that if that was the case, it had to be an albino. We started a campaign against the albino falcon, and twice I thought I had gotten it. It even dropped its prey, but it got away. It was too fast for me. It was also very intelligent. It never came back to hunt on my grandfather's farm. I would have forgotten about it had my grandfather not needled me to hunt the bird. For 2 months, I chased the albino falcon all over the valley where I lived. I learned its habits, and I could almost intuit its route of flight. Yet its speed and the suddenness of its appearance would always baffle me. I could boast that I had prevented it from taking its prey, perhaps every time we had met, but I could never bag it. In the 2 months that I carried on the strange war against the albino falcon, I came close to it only once. I had been chasing it all day, and I was tired. I'd sat down to rest and fell asleep under a tall eucalyptus tree. The sudden cry of a falcon woke me up. I opened my eyes without making any other movement, and I saw a whitish bird perched in the highest branches of the eucalyptus tree. It was the albino falcon. The chase was over. It was going to be a difficult shot. I was lying on my back, and the bird had its back turned to me. There was a sudden gust of wind, and I used it to muffle the noise of lifting my .22 long rifle to take aim. I wanted to wait until the bird had turned or until it had begun to fly, so I wouldn't miss it. But the albino bird remained motionless. In order to take a better shot, I would have needed to move, and the falcon was too fast for that. I thought that my best alternative was to wait, and I did. a long, interminable time. Perhaps what affected me was the long wait, or perhaps it was the loneliness of the spot where the bird and I were. I suddenly felt a chill up my spine, and in an unprecedented action I stood up and left. I didn't even look to see if the bird had flown away. I never attached any significance to my final act with the albino falcon. However, it was terribly strange that I didn't shoot it. I had shot dozens of falcons before. On the farm where I grew up, shooting birds or hunting any kind of animal was a matter of course. Don Juan listened attentively as I told him the story of the albino falcon. "How did you know about the white falcon?" I asked when I had finished. "I saw it," he replied. "Where?" "Right here, in front of you." I wasn't in an argumentative mood anymore. "What does all this mean?" I asked. He said that a white bird like that was an omen, and that not shooting it down was the only right thing to do. "Your death gave you a little warning," he said with a mysterious tone. "It always comes as a chill." "What are you talking about?" I said nervously. He really made me nervous with his spooky talk. "You know a lot about birds," he said. "You've killed too many of them. You know how to wait. You've waited patiently for hours. I know that. I am seeing it." His words caused a great turmoil in me. I thought that what annoyed me the most about him was his certainty. I couldn't stand his dogmatic assuredness about the issues in my own life that I wasn't sure of myself. I became engulfed in my feelings of dejection, and I didn't see him leaning over me until he actually had whispered something in my ear. I didn't understand at first, and he repeated it. He told me to turn around casually and look at a boulder to my left. He said that my death was there, staring at me, and if I turned when he signaled me, I might be capable of seeing it. He signaled me with his eyes. I turned, and I thought I saw a flickering movement over the boulder. A chill ran through my body. The muscles of my abdomen contracted involuntarily, and I experienced a jolt, a spasm. After a moment, I regained my composure, and I explained away the sensation of seeing the flickering shadow as an optical illusion caused by turning my head so abruptly. "Death is our eternal companion," Don Juan said with a most serious air. "It is always to our left, at an arm's length. It was watching you when you were watching the white falcon. It whispered in your ear, and you felt its chill as you felt it today. It's always been watching you. It always will, until the day it taps you." He extended his arm and touched me lightly on the shoulder, and at the same time he made a deep clicking sound with his tongue. The effect was devastating. I almost got sick to my stomach. "You're the boy who stalked game and waited patiently as death waits. You know very well that death is to our left, the same way you were to the left of the white falcon." His words had the strange power to plunge me into an unwarranted terror. My only defense was my compulsion to commit to writing everything he said. "How can anyone feel so important when we know that death is stalking us?" he asked. I had the feeling my answer was not really needed. I couldn't have said anything anyway. A new mood had possessed me. "The thing to do when you're impatient," he proceeded, "is to turn to your left and ask advice from your death. An immense amount of pettiness is dropped, if your death makes a gesture to you, or if you catch a glimpse of it, or if you just have the feeling that your companion is there, watching you. He leaned over again and whispered in my ear that if I turned to my left suddenly, upon seeing his signal, I could again see my death on the boulder. His eyes gave me an almost imperceptible signal, but I didn't dare to look. I told him that I believed him, and that he didn't have to press the issue any further, because I was terrified. He had one of his roaring belly laughs. He replied that the issue of our death was never pressed far enough, and I argued that it would be meaningless for me to dwell upon my death, since such a thought would only bring discomfort and fear. "You're full of crap," he exclaimed. "Death is the only wise adviser that we have. Whenever you feel, as you always do, that everything is going wrong and you're about to be annihilated, turn to your death and ask if that is so. Your death will tell you that you're wrong, that nothing really matters outside its touch. Your death will tell you, I haven't touched you yet." He shook his head and seemed to be waiting for my reply. I had none. My thoughts were running rampant. He delivered a staggering blow to my egotism. The pettiness of being annoyed with him was monstrous in the light of my death. I had the feeling he was fully aware of my change of mood. He'd turned the tide in his favor. He smiled and began to hum a Mexican tune. "Yes," he said softly, after a long pause. "One of us here has to change, and fast. One of us here has to learn again that death is the hunter, and that it is always to one's left. One of us here has to ask death's advice, and drop the cursed pettiness that belongs to men that live their lives as if death will never tap them." We remained quiet for more than an hour. Then we started walking again. We meandered in the desert chaparral for hours. I didn't ask him if there was any purpose to it. It didn't matter. Somehow he'd made me recapture an old feeling, something I'd quite forgotten. The sheer joy of just moving around without attaching any intellectual purpose to it. I wanted him to let me catch a glimpse of whatever I'd seen on the boulder. "Let me see that shadow again," I said. "You mean your death, don't you?" he replied with a touch of irony in his voice. For a moment, I felt reluctant to voice it. "Yes," I finally said, "let me see my death once again." "Not now," he said. "You're too solid." "I beg your pardon?" He began to laugh, and for some unknown reason, his laughter was no longer offensive and insidious as it had been in the past. I didn't think that it was different from the point of view of its pitch, or its loudness, or the spirit of it. The new element was my mood. In view of my impending death, my fears and annoyance were nonsense. "Let me talk to plants, then," I said. He roared with laughter. "You're too good now," he said, still laughing. "You go from one extreme to the other. Be still. There's no need to talk to plants unless you want to know their secrets, and for that you need the most unbending intent. So save your good wishes. There's no need to see your death either. It's sufficient that you feel its presence around you." (5) Assuming responsibility. Tuesday, April 11th, 1961. I arrived at Don Juan's house in the early morning on Sunday, April 9th. "Good morning, Don Juan," I said. "Am I glad to see you." He looked at me and broke into a soft laughter. He had walked to my car as I was parking it and held the door open while I gathered some packages of food that I'd brought for him. We walked to the house and sat down by the door. This was the first time I had been really aware of what I was doing there. For 3 months, I had actually looked forward to going back to the field. It was as if a time bomb set within myself had exploded, and suddenly I had remembered something transcendental to me. I had remembered that once in my life, I had been very patient and very efficient. Before Don Juan could say anything, I asked him the question that had been pressing hard in my mind. For 3 months, I had been obsessed with the memory of the albino falcon. How did he know about it when I myself had forgotten? He laughed, but didn't answer. I pleaded with him to tell me. "It was nothing," he said with his usual conviction. "Anyone could tell that you're strange. You're just numb, that's all." I felt that he was again getting me off guard and pushing me into a corner in which I didn't care to be. "Is it possible to see our death?" I asked, trying to remain within the topic. "Sure," he said, laughing. "It's here, with us." "How do you know that?" "I'm an old man. With age, one learns all kinds of things." "I know lots of old people, but they've never learned this. How come you did?" "Well, let's say that I know all kinds of things, because I don't have a personal history, and because I don't feel more important than anything else, and because my death is sitting with me, right here." He extended his left arm and moved his fingers as if he were actually petting something. I laughed. I knew where he was leading me. The old devil was going to clobber me again, probably with my self-importance, but I didn't mind this time. The memory that once I'd had a superb patience had filled me with a strange, quiet euphoria that had dispelled most of my feelings of nervousness and intolerance towards Don Juan. What I felt instead was a sensation of wonder about his acts. "Who are you, really?" I asked. He seemed surprised. He opened his eyes to an enormous size and blinked like a bird, closing his eyelids as if they were a shutter. They came down and went up again, and his eyes remained in focus. His maneuvers startled me, and I recoiled, and he laughed with childlike abandon. "For you, I am Juan Matus, and I am at your service," he said, with exaggerated politeness. I then asked my other burning question. "What did you do to me the first day we met?" I was referring to the look he had given me. "Me? Nothing," he replied with a tone of innocence. I described to him the way I'd felt when he had looked at me, and how incongruous it had been for me to be tongue-tied by it. He laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. I again felt a surge of animosity toward him. I thought that I was being so serious and thoughtful, and he was being so Indian in his coarse ways. He apparently detected my mood and stopped laughing all of a sudden. After a long hesitation, I told him that his laughter had annoyed me because I was seriously trying to understand what had happened to me. "There's nothing to understand," he replied, undisturbed. I reviewed for him the sequence of unusual events that had taken place since I had met him, starting with the mysterious look he had given me, to remembering the albino falcon, and seeing on the boulder the shadow he had said was my death. "Why are you doing all this to me?" I asked. There was no belligerence in my question. I was only curious as to why it was me in particular. "You asked me to tell you what I know about plants," he said. I noticed a tinge of sarcasm in his voice. He sounded as if he were humoring me. But what you've told me so far has nothing to do with plants, I protested. His reply was that it took time to learn about them. My feeling was that it was useless to argue with him. I realized then the total idiocy of the easy and absurd resolutions I'd made. While I was at home, I had promised myself that I was never going to lose my temper or feel annoyed with Don Juan. In the actual situation, however, the minute he rebuffed me, I had another attack of peevishness. I felt there was no way for me to interact with him, and that angered me. "Think of your death now," Don Juan said suddenly. "It is at arm's length. It may tap you any moment. So really, you have no time for crappy thoughts and moods. None of us have time for that. Do you want to know what I did to you the first day we met? I saw you, and I saw that you thought you were lying to me. But you weren't. Not really." I told him that his explanation confused me even more. He replied that that was the reason he didn't want to explain his acts, and that explanations weren't necessary. He said that the only thing that counted was action. Acting instead of talking. He pulled out a straw mat and lay down, propping his head up with a bundle. He made himself comfortable, and then he told me that there was another thing I had to perform, if I really wanted to learn about plants. "What was wrong with you when I saw you, and what is wrong with you now, is that you don't like to take responsibility for what you do," he said slowly, as if to give me time to understand what he was saying. "When you were telling me all those things in the bus depot, you were aware that they were lies. Why were you lying?" I explained that my objective had been to find a key informant for my work. Don Juan smiled and began humming a Mexican tune. "When a man decides to do something, he must go all the way," he said. "But he must take responsibility for what he does. No matter what he does, he must know, first, why he is doing it, and then he must proceed with his actions without having doubts or remorse about them." He examined me. I didn't know what to say. Finally, I ventured an opinion, almost as a protest. "That's an impossibility," I said. He asked me why, and I said that perhaps, ideally, that was what everybody thought they should do. In practice, however, there was no way to avoid doubts and remorse. "Of course there is a way," he replied with conviction. "Look at me," he said. "I have no doubts or remorse. Everything I do is my decision and my responsibility. The simplest thing I do, to take you for a walk in the desert, for instance, may very well mean my death. Death is stalking me. Therefore, I have no room for doubts or remorse. If I have to die as a result of taking you for a walk, then I must die. You, on the other hand, feel that you're immortal, and the decisions of an immortal man can be cancelled or regretted or doubted. In a world where death is the hunter, my friend, there isn't time for regrets or doubts. There is only time for decisions." I argued in sincerity that in my opinion that was an unreal world, because it was arbitrarily made by taking an idealized form of behavior and saying that that was the way to proceed. I told him the story of my father, who used to give me endless lectures about the wonders of a healthy mind and a healthy body, and how young men should temper their bodies with hardships and with feats of athletic competition. He was a young man. When I was 8 years old, he was only 27. During the summertime, as a rule, he would come from the city where he taught school, to spend at least a month with me at my grandparents' farm, where I lived. It was a hellish month for me. I told Don Juan one instance of my father's behavior that I thought would apply to the situation at hand. Almost immediately upon arriving at the farm, my father would insist on taking a long walk with me at his side so we could talk things over. And while we were talking, he would make plans for us to go swimming every day at 6 a.m. At night he would set the alarm for 5:30 to have plenty of time, because at 6 sharp we had to be in the water. And when the alarm would go off in the morning, he would jump out of bed, put on his glasses, go to the window, and look out. I had even memorized the ensuing monologue. A bit cloudy today. Listen, I'm gonna lie down again for just 5 minutes, okay? No more than 5. I'm just going to stretch my muscles and fully wake up. He would invariably fall asleep again until 10, sometimes until noon. I told Don Juan that what annoyed me was his refusal to give up his obviously phony resolutions. He would repeat this ritual every morning until I would finally hurt his feelings by refusing to set the alarm clock. They weren't phony resolutions, Don Juan said, obviously taking sides with my father. He just didn't know how to get out of bed, that's all. At any rate, I said, I'm always leery of unreal resolutions. What would be a resolution that is real, then? Don Juan asked, with a coy smile. If my father would have said to himself that he couldn't go swimming at 6 in the morning, but perhaps at 3 in the afternoon. Your resolutions injure the spirit, Don Juan said with an air of great seriousness. I thought I even detected a note of sadness in his tone. We were quiet for a long time. My peevishness had vanished. I thought of my father. He didn't want to swim at 3 in the afternoon, don't you see? Don Juan said. His words made me jump. I told him that my father was weak, and so was his world of ideal acts that he never performed. I was almost shouting. Don Juan didn't say a word. He shook his head slowly in a rhythmical way. I felt terribly sad. Thinking of my father always gave me a consuming feeling. You think you were stronger, don't you? He asked in a casual tone. I said I did, and I began to tell him all the emotional turmoil that my father had put me through, but he interrupted me. Was he mean to you? He asked. No. Was he petty with you? No. Did he do all he could for you? Yes. Then what was wrong with him? Again, I began to shout that he was weak, but I caught myself and lowered my voice. I felt a bit ludicrous being cross-examined by Don Juan. What are you doing all this for? I said. We were supposed to be talking about plants. I felt more annoyed and despondent than ever. I told him that he had no business, or the remotest qualifications, to pass judgment on my behavior, and he exploded into a belly laugh. When you get angry, you always feel righteous, don't you? He said, and blinked like a bird. He was right. I had the tendency to feel justified at being angry. Let's not talk about my father, I said, feigning a happy mood. Let's talk about plants. No, let's talk about your father, he insisted. That's the place to begin today. If you think that you were so much stronger than he, why didn't you go swimming at 6 in the morning in his place? I told him that I couldn't believe he was seriously asking me that. I had always thought that swimming at 6 in the morning was my father's business and not mine. It was also your business, from the moment you accepted his idea, Don Juan snapped at me. I said that I had never accepted it, that I had always known my father wasn't truthful to himself. Don Juan asked me, matter-of-factly, why I hadn't voiced my opinion at the time. "You don't tell your father things like that," I said, as a weak explanation. "Why not?" "That wasn't done in my house, that's all." "You've done worse things in your house," he declared like a judge from the bench. "The only thing you never did was to shine your spirit." There was such a devastating force in his words that they echoed in my mind. He brought all my defenses down. I couldn't argue with him. I took refuge in writing my notes. I tried a last feeble explanation and said that all my life I had encountered people of my father's kind who had, like my father, hooked me somehow into their schemes, and as a rule I had always been left dangling. "You're complaining," he said softly. "You've been complaining all your life because you don't assume responsibility for your decisions. If you would have assumed responsibility for your father's idea of swimming at 6 in the morning, you would have swum, by yourself if necessary. Or you would have told him to go to hell the first time he opened his mouth after you knew his devices. But you didn't say anything. Therefore, you were as weak as your father. To assume the responsibility of one's decisions means that one is ready to die for them." Wait, I said. "You're twisting this around." He didn't let me finish. I was going to tell them that I had used my father only as an example of an unrealistic way of acting, and that nobody in his right mind would be willing to die for such an idiotic thing. "It doesn't matter what the decision is," he said. "Nothing could be more or less serious than anything else, don't you see? In a world where death is the hunter, there are no small or big decisions. There are only decisions that we make in the face of our inevitable death." I couldn't say anything. Perhaps an hour went by. Don Juan was perfectly motionless on his mat, although he wasn't sleeping. "Why do you tell me all this, Don Juan?" I asked. "Why are you doing this to me?" "You came to me," he said. "No, that wasn't the case. You were brought to me. And I've had a gesture with you." "I beg your pardon?" "You could have had a gesture with your father, by swimming for him. But you didn't, perhaps because you were too young. I've lived longer than you. I have nothing pending. There's no hurry in my life. Therefore, I can properly have a gesture with you." In the afternoon, we went for a hike. I easily kept his pace and marveled again at his stupendous physical prowess. He walked so nimbly and with such sure steps that next to him I was like a child. We went in an easterly direction. I noticed then that he didn't like to talk while he walked. If I spoke to him, he would stop walking in order to answer me. After a couple of hours, we came to a hill. He sat down and signaled me to sit by him. He announced in a mock dramatic tone that he was going to tell me a story. He said that once upon a time there was a young man, a destitute Indian, who lived among the white men in a city. He had no home, no relatives, no friends. He had come into the city to find his fortune and had found only misery and pain. From time to time he made a few cents working like a mule, barely enough for a morsel. Otherwise, he had to beg or steal food. Don Juan said that one day the young man went to the marketplace. He walked up and down the street in a haze, his eyes wild upon seeing all the good things that were gathered there. He was so frantic that he didn't see where he was walking, and ended up tripping over some baskets and falling on top of an old man. The old man was carrying 4 enormous gourds, and had just sat down to rest and eat. Don Juan smiled knowingly and said that the old man found it quite strange that the young man had stumbled on him. He wasn't angry at being disturbed, but amazed at why this particular young man had fallen on top of him. The young man, on the other hand, was angry and told him to get out of his way. He wasn't concerned at all about the ultimate reason for their meeting. He hadn't noticed that their paths had actually crossed. Don Juan mimicked the motions of someone going after something that was rolling over. He said that the old man's gourds had turned over and were rolling down the street. When the young man saw the gourds, he thought he had found his food for the day. He helped the old man up and insisted on helping him carry the heavy gourds. The old man told him that he was on his way to his home in the mountains, and the young man insisted on going with him, at least part of the way. The old man took the road to the mountains, and as they walked, he gave the young man part of the food he had bought at the market. The young man ate to his heart's content, and when he was quite satisfied, he began to notice how heavy the gourds were, and clutched them tightly. Don Juan opened his eyes and smiled with a devilish grin and said that the young man asked, "What do you carry in these gourds?" The old man didn't answer, but told him that he was going to show him a companion or friend who could alleviate his sorrows and give him advice and wisdom about the ways of the world. Don Juan made a majestic gesture with both hands and said that the old man summoned the most beautiful deer that the young man had ever seen. The deer was so tame that it came to him and walked around him. It glittered and shone. The young man was spellbound and knew right away that it was a spirit deer. The old man told him then that if he wished to have that friend and its wisdom, all he had to do was to let go of the gourds. Don Juan's grin portrayed ambition. He said that the young man's petty desires were pricked upon hearing such a request. Don Juan's eyes became small and devilish as he voiced the young man's question. "What do you have in these 4 enormous gourds?" Don Juan said that the old man very serenely replied that he was carrying food, pinole, and water. He stopped narrating the story and walked around in a circle a couple of times. I didn't know what he was doing, but apparently it was part of the story. The circle seemed to portray the deliberations of the young man. Don Juan said that, of course, the young man hadn't believed a word. He calculated that if the old man, who was obviously a wizard, was willing to give a spirit deer for his gourds, then the gourds must have been filled with power beyond belief. Don Juan contorted his face again into a devilish grin and said that the young man declared that he wanted to have the gourds. There was a long pause that seemed to mark the end of the story. Don Juan remained quiet, yet I was sure he wanted me to ask about it, and I did. "What happened to the young man?" "He took the gourds," he replied with a smile of satisfaction. There was another long pause. I laughed. I thought that this had been a real Indian story. Don Juan's eyes were shining as he smiled at me. There was an air of innocence about him. He began to laugh in soft spurts and asked me, "Don't you want to know about the gourds?" "Of course I want to know. I thought that was the end of the story." "Oh, no," he said, with a mischievous light in his eyes. "The young man took his gourds and ran away to an isolated place and opened them." "What did he find?" I asked. Don Juan glanced at me, and I had the feeling he was aware of my mental gymnastics. He shook his head and chuckled. "Well," I urged him, "were the gourds empty?" "There was only food and water inside the gourds," he said, "and the young man, in a fit of anger, smashed them against the rocks." I said that his reaction was only natural. Anyone in his position would have done the same. Don Juan's reply was that the young man was a fool who didn't know what he was looking for. He didn't know what power was, so he couldn't tell whether or not he had found it. He hadn't taken responsibility for his decision, therefore he was angered by his blunder. He expected to gain something and got nothing instead. Don Juan speculated that if I were the young man, and if I had followed my inclinations, I would have ended up angry and remorseful, and would, no doubt, have spent the rest of my life feeling sorry for myself for what I had lost. Then he explained the behavior of the old man. He had cleverly fed the young man, so as to give him the daring of a satisfied stomach. Thus the young man, upon finding only food in the gourds, smashed them in a fit of anger. Had he been aware of his decision and assumed responsibility for it, Don Juan said, he would have taken the food, and would have been more than satisfied with it. And perhaps he might have even realized that that food was power too.